I'm in the unfortunate position to speak last on a Friday after a long day, meaning the levels of attention are quite low. But it's also an advantage because I can get away with things. Having said that, I want to thank Mark Donfried, the Director General, ICD, for the invitation and for the hospitality and warm welcome that we've received for the last few days. Now, many people will see the fall of the wall of Berlin from various perspectives, depending on the perspectives of those who are looking at it. And so for Africans, this city is very historic because this is where in 1884, 1885, European powers met in the Berlin Conference to partition Africa for colonization. And that has created permanent history and linkages between the two continents, Europe and Africa. And therefore, even as we discuss about the fall of the Berlin Wall, we are also informed that this is a history-creating city in many ways besides the war. This city also has been a theater of the activities and the geopolitical intrigues in Europe itself, Africa aside. And the fall of the war cannot be discussed without linking it with the effects of the two world wars, again Berlin playing and being the theater for the various activities that resulted from the two world wars. The war was in existence for 28 years. But the fact that we are here today, 30 years after the fall of the war, is a reminder of the reality that the world may live longer with the consequences of the fall of the war than it lived with the war itself. And therefore, this is going to be quite a relevant memory for many years to come. Thirdly, I want to say that the expectations of Germany after being reunited, the two Germanys in 1989, and also the expectations of the world was that the fall of the Berlin Wall created optimism that the ideological divide that informed the war, the demise of that war would bring a freer world, a more tolerant world, a world in which human rights and fundamental freedoms would thrive for many years to come. 3 decades later, as we remember the Berlin Wall and its horrors in terms of limiting human freedom and the spirit of movement and human dignity, we are here to look at what gains the world generally, Germany and Europe and the world, what gains can we say have been accrued in the last 30 years, and what pains also we can associate with this historic activity. And I'll be very brief. For me, I see 5 major gains from what happened in 1989. Number 1, and this just from a global perspective, one of the major gains of the fall of the Berlin Wall is a remarkable enhancement of the principles and values of freedom, tolerance, and the respect for human rights and democracy around the world, generally speaking. Two, although the international peace and security has had its own difficulties associated with the fall of the war and the end of the Cold War, there has been some improvement in terms of consensus building around the world, and therefore international diplomacy has become less onerous after the fall of the war. And this has enabled multilateral peace and security arrangements at regional and global levels to backstop and buttress national security systems. Third, while it is true that in some countries in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Middle East, there have been some lapses in national security system, in a more general sense, the lapses in these national security systems, which has brought instances of gross human rights violations, as, on the flip side, enabled the world to build consensus to establish international judicial penal systems which were impossible to put in place during the Cold War and during the existence of the Berlin Wall. It is for that reason, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, that you will notice that before the 1990s, the world, because of the ideological paralysis, was unable to put in place international criminal justice system for punishing gross violations of human rights. Thereafter, it became easier to successfully build momentum, leading to the establishment of a number of international criminal tribunals, starting with the ad hoc tribunals. The Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia, 1993, the International Tribunal for Rwanda, 1994, the International Special Court or Hybrid Court for Sierra Leone in 2002, the one for East Timor in 2002, the one for Cambodia in 2003, and most remarkably, the spectacular consensus that led to the establishment of a permanent international criminal court based in the Netherlands, which was established in 2002. This, in my view, although the establishment of these institutions arose from very sad instances of gross and massive human rights violations, it helped, on the flip side, to have these institutions in place to deal with perpetrators. And significantly, there has been deterrence on these fronts, especially on the commission of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Thirdly, the fall of the Berlin Wall has become a powerful catalyst for rapid regime change across Eastern Europe and Africa. Many states in former socialist Eastern Europe and Africa have opened up to democratic governance. They have written new national constitutions and created new local institutions to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Long-serving dictators were easily removed from power through civil unrest or through democratic elections under new constitutions so written, because these constitutions themselves came with limits, presidential term limits. Now, this regime change and democratization, especially in Eastern Europe and Africa, has ensured that the values of constitutionally entrenched human rights, fundamental freedoms of the individual, and free democratic expression have become truly universal. The challenge now, 30 years on, for the countries involved or the countries affected is to try and move beyond constitutions to create constitutionalism, which is the culture of respecting constitutions and enforcing constitutions, to move from norm setting to norm enforcement. And this is where Africa can borrow from Europe. And for colleagues who had asked about what the African Union and the European Union could do to bring down further barriers across the continents, is one is for Europe to support Africa to move from norm setting to norm enforcement, because at the continental level and national level, a lot of effort has been achieved towards a setting of norms and bringing new constitutions, democratic elections, and now the next stage of enforcing those norms and making those institutions work, and respect for those institutions is what is important. In other words, the hardware is there. What we need is the software of running the structures that have been established. Broadly, those are the gains. What are the pains? One, civil wars, which is a contradiction of some of the things I have said earlier on, because again, the Cold War helped to keep the world bipolar, and the mutual suspicion between the US on the other hand and its allies, and also the Soviet Union and its allies, made sure that the checks and balances made sure that many of the weaker states in Africa, Eastern Europe, were protected from degenerating to civil war. And the moment that bipolar system collapsed with the war, there have been numerous civil wars in the 1990s. And these wars have come, secondly, with gross human rights violations, which has left many citizens healing ugly scars of violence, as well as commission of egregious violations of human rights, including genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. From Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, to Srebrenica, to Rwanda, to Sierra Leone, to East Timor in Asia, to many other parts of the globe. Thus, the world has come to painfully accept that the mutual suspicion between the West and the East during the existence of the Berlin Wall had succeeded in sedating and tranquilizing the infrastructure for the commission of large-scale and egregious human rights violations. Thirdly, the pain that has come with the collapse of the war is massive refugee flows as a result of the wars that I have talked about. Somali, for example, the long-serving ruler Said Barre was toppled in 1991, and that country has never been the same again. The effect has been huge flows of refugees to Europe, to North America, especially. Ethiopia, the same, the fall of Mengistu Haile Mariam around the same year. And as I have said, this has caused a lot of movement of refugees to Scandinavia, to Western Europe, Canada, and the United States of America. In reaction to these refugee flows, the countries which received these massive flows of human beings who had been uprooted from their homes started developing wars, like the Berlin Wall, now forming other wars, not specifically concrete wars, but this has led to xenophobia, It has led to imaginary wars. For example, southern countries south of Europe. There have been very many refugees from Africa who have lost their lives in the Mediterranean Sea because of the very difficult conditions of entering southern Europe for people who are running away from oppression. Now, after the war, we have also seen the other countries coming with their own version of a Berlin Wall. South Korea, for example, one of the countries which is still very communist, has had its own war of keeping its people inside and everybody else outside. Even advanced democracies like USA, there has been a recent proposal to create a wall in the southern border of that country to keep foreigners from accessing the United States of America. So even as we look at the Berlin Wall, we are looking at a present phenomena that is has mutated, and in terms of both the actual concrete barriers, but also other wars of prejudice, as other speakers said, and xenophobia and discrimination. Now, so there have been other emergence of other wars and hard borders. I've named North Korea and the US proposal to create a wall. There have been others, the border at Hungary and so forth and so on. Number 5, because I had 5 pains: the civil war, the gross human rights violations leading to the refugees. That's number 3. Number 4 is the emergence of hard wars, and number 5, the rise of extremism, intolerance, and terrorism, which was never experienced in the days of the existence of the Berlin Wall. Thus, utilization of violence to spread fear and thereby attain political or ideological goals, as well as increased exports and globalization of violent terror by groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria, and its variants, strands, and affiliates spread in Africa, Europe, and Asia, and also Al-Shabaab in Eastern Africa. These do not appear to abate. In response to this growth of terrorism and intolerance, there has been countries, especially in the north, who have adopted very tough measures on international movements of persons and funds. And this has seen a rise in negative profiling of people and consequential discrimination, both which amount to a frontal and deadly attack on human dignity. In conclusion, they say that the world has changed dramatically since the fall of the Berlin Wall. If so, what does the fall of Berlin Wall signify to humanity across the world? Is the world freer, safer, and more united today? Or as a combination of multiple insecurities in the world and the threats to freedoms mutated and conspired to wipe out the gains of the post-Berlin Wall freedoms, replacing them with the pains of civil wars, refugee flows and displacement, violent terrorism, intolerance, tighter border controls, and new physical or abstract wars of division. The jury is still out there. Notwithstanding the above, as we mark 30 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, I can only draw one fundamental observation from where I sit, that humanity is too dynamic to be walled in or walled out. And more so, there has been a near permanent and arguably irreversible integration of markets in the global economy and interconnectedness brought by the post-Berlin Wall era of globalization, which makes the project of making or building physical or abstract walls to separate and isolate people futile into the foreseeable future. In particular, the phenomenal rise and exponential growth in the use of social media in the post-Berlin Wall period has rendered borders, barriers, and walls, whether physical or virtual, irrelevant. Humanity must look at history. Although we are scarred by the divisive historic war and its antecedents, we should audit the gains and pains of the post-Berlin War dispensation, ease the imprint of this war from mind, and create new spaces to give the human race its fullest appreciation of the gains accrued from the fall of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago. Berlin has survived in the most difficult times. Going forward, let us all, as humanity, help Berlin and its people to live, thrive, and prosper in the former divided city, now the city of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Now I remember what I was going to say. I was going to say that the professor's law degree, Master's of Law degree, was in International Human Rights, Law, and Democracy, which was indeed reflected in this talk. Thank you very much indeed. Now, are there any questions from the floor? Yes?
Yes. Yes, sir. Yeah. Dear Senator, thank you for sharing your experience. We all share moral obligations to you and to dear speaker here in Europe after all those hundreds of years of colonization and looting of African continent. And we feel our guilt is here and moral obligation to Africa to keep our borders open after all those challenges inside of you great continent. But having such experience and demonstrated such maturity like in your just last presented speech, can you advise us what to do for European Union countries and for our allies, United States, Canada, and the Western world, when we have quicker new colonization from our point of view presented by not democratic countries like China and probably Russia, and what will be your advice to do for democratic countries like European Union, Canada, and United States, how to support you building mature democracies, party systems, the political party systems in your countries who will keep democracy stable, and how you can comment how it will be possible to avoid such a contradiction when some in the Human Rights Committee of United Nations, you have behind you remarkable colors of United Nations, not only European Union. In the Committee on Human Rights will be presented such mature countries like, let's say, oral democracies like Central African Republic, your respectful country, but not countries related to massive violation of human rights. So that's you have for us some, some rising for us question marks to listen to their resolutions. Will step a little bit in some gap to the realities when the countries who have mass violation against their civil population are telling to us what to do in the human rights in United Nations Commission on Human Rights. So for that reason, I would like to have your comment, if possible. What will be your advice to your European Union friends, and how we should behave, and how we should, I'm sorry to say, compete with not democratic countries who are trying to use your land and resources in a very cheap, easy way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I think that's a very complex question, but in the interest of time, I'll just say that it is my view that where Africa is now, the hardware, that's the norms and institutions, are fairly established. That will be supported by the movement from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, which has very good legislative text, actually quite, and they are informed by the history, the cruel history that Africa has experienced. Some of the texts in terms of international law are quite progressive, including the rights of the African Union to intervene, even using military means to protect cases of genocide, human rights violations in a gross manner, crimes against humanity, which is actually unprecedented, because initially the principle of state sovereignty was held in very high esteem, as it should be. But the experience of Africa has been that when you have large-scale violations of human rights, like it happened in Rwanda in the early 90s, and former Yugoslavia in the same time, you cannot hide behind sovereignty and allow masses of people to be butchered. So in terms of norm setting, I believe Africa has done a good job. I have already also said at the national level, many countries actually have fairly good constitutional provisions that have come in place in the 1990s as a result of this liberalization of and universality of human rights. So Europe, the project that remains for Europe is to partner with Africa to develop capacities to enforce norm enforcement. And if there is a way, if there is any debt that Europe owes Africa, it should be to partner with Africa to make sure that history is not repeated. Secondly, other than helping Africa to have the capacity to develop the software for managing the hardware of peace and security and human rights, there is also need to help Africa through trade to be able to uplift the socio-economic rights of the Africans. If Europe does those two things, their sins will be forgiven and forgotten.